So one of my subscribers had asked to go back over the 1914 thing, Jehovah's Witnesses and the whole thing about 1914. The thing about 1914 teaching is it's really the fundamental teaching of the organization. It is the biggest thing going. Yeah. The whole organization is actually built on Jesus' kingdom being established in 1914. How did they get there? Let me run through this brief synopsis. See, I'm one of the people who actually remember this and knew it when I was in the organization. So what they said was the Jews were released from captivity in Babylon in 537 BCE. All right. So according to the prophecies in Jeremiah 25:11 and 12, Jeremiah 29:10, and 2 Chronicles 36:21, it was supposed to be for 70 years they were there. Now, scholars and secular historians agree with the 537 thing, but J-Dub says, well, they were supposed to be there for 70 years, so you count back 70 years. That was in 607 BCE. So 607 was when the last Davidic king sat on God's throne. Okay, so that king was then moved, and they applied the prophecy, the 7 times prophecy related to Nebuchadnezzar. They applied that prophecy to the Davidic kings. So from 607 BCE, these 7 times would pass over. You go into Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14, and that shows that 3.5 times is equal to 1,260 days. So then 7 times would be 2,520 years. You apply the day per year principle in Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 to 27, and then you get 2,520 years to that. So from 607 BCE, 2,520 years later is 1914. And that's when they say the king of God's kingdom, Jesus Christ, became king. Because he was, the throne of David. He received the throne of David in 1914. All right. So yeah, I still remember that. That's how they got there. Now, the thing about that teaching is that the 70-year thing is really the foundation of the teaching. So going from 537 back to 607 BCE, that's the foundation of the teaching. Now look, that whole teaching about 1914, I'm just going to say that was from C.T. Russell. C.T. Russell was into that Egypt stuff, because he was a Freemason. He, wrote about this stuff way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Jehovah's Witnesses have continued that prophecy or that belief since then. Now, there were some other beliefs too about 1887 and all this other kind of stuff, but whatever. The one that they built their organization around was 1914. Jesus became king. That was the start of the last days in 1914. So the 70 years from what they interpret in Jeremiah is the important thing that 1914 thing is built on. Now I'm just going to read how they translate this verse. Jeremiah 29:10 says, "For this is what Jehovah says, when 70 years at Babylon are fulfilled, I will turn my attention to you, and I will make you my good promise to bring you back to this place." Now, it says 70 years at Babylon. And it's very interesting that the Hebrew word there can actually mean 70 years for Babylon. And me personally, I would tend to accept that it means for Babylon. It should be translated for Babylon, not at Babylon. Translating at Babylon is religious interpretation in the translation, and that's okay. I mean, all of them do it when they translate scripture. They're going to put their religious interpretation in at key moments. But really, it's up to us. We've got the Hebrew and the Greek original. I mean, you go to Strong's, they got an app, pay $1.99. You got this app, you got all that access to the Hebrew and Greek words, and then, hey, you make up your mind for yourself. So anyway, the 70 years, you would have to count at 607 BCE, and that's when they say that Jerusalem was destroyed and the king was removed. But here's the thing about it. If you could actually read what Jeremiah wrote in context in Jeremiah chapter 25, you see that the 70 years means something completely different than and something as related to the nation of Israel, and in terms of how long they were held captive in Babylon. Now, I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to read one important verse in Jeremiah chapter 25. This is verse 9. Now it says, I am sending, this is what Jehovah of Armies has said, starting in verse 8. But anyway, verse 9 says, I am sending for all the families of the north, declares Jehovah, sending for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring him against this land, talking about the nation of Judah. Now notice this, and against its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. Look at verse 11. It says, and all this land will be reduced to ruins and will become an object of horror, and these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. See, they don't put the context there, and they don't expect us to go back and read. So when you're looking at Jeremiah 25, 17 through 26, it's talking about all the nations that Babylon would defeat in a campaign that lasted basically 70 years, where they would be defeated, and then they would have to serve the king of Babylon. Now, in 2 Chronicles 36:21, it talks about the 70 years of desolation and paying back its Sabbath. It corresponds to this, even though it's worded as such to say that the land was desolated for 70 years and had to pay back its Sabbath for 70 years. Well, it actually reads that it had to pay back the Sabbath for 70 years. All right, so the land started paying back its Sabbaths. Yeah, it did in 607, but it wasn't devastated in 607. So when you look at the facts of it and what history records, history actually records better what's stated in Jeremiah chapter 25 than what Jehovah's Witnesses say happened for that 70 years. See, so actually in 607 BCE, Babylon destroyed Assyria. Okay, so really, if you go back to 2 Kings, I think it's chapter 29, I want to say. But if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 29, it actually starts off telling who Babylon went after. So first they went after Assyria, defeated Assyria. Then they went after Egypt with King Pharaoh Necho. Now remember, King Pharaoh Necho actually dominated Jerusalem and Judea, or Judah, let's say that. But then they were defeated, I want to say, at Carchemish by the Babylonians in 606 BCE. Now they came back through the Babylonians after, maybe it was 605, okay, 606, 605, somewhere around there. But Jerusalem was actually first besieged by Babylon in 597 BCE. That's when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's when they were taken. I mean, they stripped the land of a lot of folks. So they were taken back then. And history actually records this. So it was 597, BCE, when Babylon first laid siege to Jerusalem and Judah. Now, because they rebelled, he came back in 587 BCE and then destroyed the nation of Israel. The nation of Judah and Jerusalem. And then the king was finally removed from their throne. And if you can go look in 2 Kings chapter 25, it talks about this. But what's the timing? So if you're looking at it as a 70-year period, and early part of that 70-year period when Nebuchadnezzar first started dominating those nations, beginning with Assyria in 607, and then coming there for the next 20 years, then they got down to Jerusalem and destroyed some of the other surrounding nations too. So actually, Jerusalem and Judah was destroyed in 587, not 607. Now history records all of this, and they got it recorded everywhere. Only Jehovah's Witnesses were the ones who came out from C.T. Russell from when the organization first got started, and then they were the one talking about 607 BCE was when Jerusalem was destroyed. Because they, doing this 70-year thing. And then they built their entire organization around this thing. That, okay, with this 70-year period, 607, 2,520 years later, it was 1914. They built the entire organization around that. But here's something that you may not know. For some of you may not remember the man named Ray France. Now, people like me, I was around back then, and some guys older than me remember Ray France. He was on a governing body, and he resigned basically from the governing body. He later got this fellowship on some BS for real. But anyway, he wrote his book, Crisis of Conscience. He explained that, I want to say it was back in the late 60s, the organization sent him and another brother from Bethel to the foremost researcher and expert on the destruction of Jerusalem and that time period. And he wrote this in his book, Crisis of Conscience, and he said that when they went to this guy and asked, was there any possibility that the date could be wrong at 587, it was really 607, he said that there would have to be a massive conspiracy to change the dates from all the information that they had. And this back in 587, would have had to be a massive conspiracy to make the date 507, because all the records that they found from that historical period, I'm not just talking about in the area, but I mean records surrounding. You have a war in one area, everyone is recording what they know. So every record that they found in every surrounding area related to the destruction of Jerusalem from every nation that had something, all said 587. Those two guys had to bring this information back to the quote-unquote governing body back then. And they knew back then that 607 BCE was false. But yet, they had built their entire organization upon it. They couldn't take it back. So that's just something you got to know. Jehovah's Witnesses, the higher-ups, know that 607 BCE is not a real date. It's a false date. So what were they going to do about it? They had built the organization over it. Well, look, they slowly, over time, started moving away from teaching that whole thing. They just state that 1914 was when Jesus became king. In fact, in 2014, I want to say, was it 2014? Yeah, I think it was 2014. They stayed on the district convention. If y'all remember this, they had a video, and how on that video they were showing a guy kind of like myself who understood how to get from 537 all the way to 1914. He was going over that in a Bible study with a Jehovah's Witness Bible student. They had this thing portrayed, and the Bible student was kind of rolling his eyes as the guy explained that. See, so what they were trying to do was tell them, get away from trying to explain these things. Don't even worry about it. Just 1914 is the date. You don't even have to know how we got there. That's what they were saying. So they wanted to get away from the whole 1914 because they knew it was a false doctrine. And if someone looked deep enough, a witness looked deep enough, he could see and find that it was a false doctrine. Matter of fact, it was a guy back in the day. I forget, he was over somewhere in Europe, Sweden or something like that. He really believed in the whole 1914 thing and Jesus' prophecy at Matthew 24 and the thing. And then he started doing his own research. And then he came out and found that thing was false. And he was sent everything to the organization, just like letting them know that, hey, these are things that were being said, because he felt it was an organization of truth and all this. These are things that are being said. But here's what history finds, and he had all this documentation. They just fellowship that dude. They just came right out and just fellowshipped him. I mean, judicial meeting, disfellowship. It wasn't even a question. He was even kind of surprised at the meeting. I remember them talking about that. So yeah, they knew that it was false. And they know it's false today. That's why they move away from it. The thing is that they don't care if you know that it's false or not. Either you're going to be in the organization or not. See, so most folks, honestly, in Jehovah's Witnesses don't care. They don't really care. 1914, okay, fine, we'll just accept that. They don't want to know how you got there. They don't really care. And so another thing to add to it is that the further away you get from 1914, the more your doctrine has to change. I mean, look, to say, and we were taught that the 1914 generation, in other words, people who were old enough to understand the connection of what happened with World War I in 1914 and everything that was going on, that those people would see Jesus return. Okay, so they would see the entire thing within a generation. It was saying, going from Matthew 24. So they're matching all these things up. So they said, excuse me, y'all, but they said that entire generation would see the end. But now you're 108 years from 1914. And then you're talking about someone who had to be at least, 15? So you're talking people that would be 123. God said you don't live 120 years. So the further away they get from 1914, the harder it is to maintain that doctrine. Because it's a false doctrine. So when you think about that, it is false. And besides, look, here's a simple thing to refute the 1914 thing, that Jesus became king in 1914. You know, we read the scripture all the time in the organization, but our minds are so blind that we didn't ever stop and think about the implications of what Jesus said. Matthew 28:18, right before he ascended to heaven, he said, all authority has been given me in heaven and on earth, right? That was in 33 CE. If all authority had been given Jesus in heaven and on earth, how much more authority was he going to get in 1914 if he had all authority? I mean, it's just ridiculous to even think, not to ask that question. Well, wait a minute. If he had all authority then, how much more was he going to get? Anyway, so another scripture is in Philippians 2:9-11, where it said that really, at that time, that every need would bend, those in the heavens, those on the earth, and those underneath the earth would bend to Jesus. Okay, every knee will bend. And openly acknowledge that God appointed him as Lord and King, right? How much more knee bending was there going to be in 1914 if it happened back there in 33? So look, I just want to kind of point that thing out. The whole 1914 thing, it may not be big to you, it may be big to some other folks, but the whole 1914 doctrine is a false doctrine, and that is the foundational doctrine of the Jehovah's Witness organization. So, if you're ever talking to, a witness, a family member, and they bring up the 1914 thing, hey, just hit them. You ain't got to get into a debate with them. Just hit them with Matthew 28:18 and just ask them, well, how much more authority he's going to get in 1914 if he got all authority in 33 CE. Alright, this is Rick the Disciple. Just want to throw that out there. I'm out. Like, share, and subscribe.